Hello and welcome. I'm Randall Griffey.
And I'm Kelly Baum. Randy and I are co-curators of Alice Neel, People Come First.
This exhibition is a career-spanning retrospective of the work of this beloved and revered American artist of the 20th century. The exhibition focuses on her renowned and popular paintings that Neel liked to call pictures of people, not portraits. It also includes works by Neel in other genres, including still life, cityscape, early erotic watercolors, and works on paper, but also personal effects and photographs drawn from the Neel estate, and ephemera connected to Neel's life and activities, especially her political affiliations, that provide a kind of personal insight into Neel and her art. The exhibition is meant to be expansive, to provide this fully fleshed picture of Neel as one of the great American artists of the 20th century.
Alice Neel was born in 1900 and died in 1984, so her life spans almost the whole of the 20th century, as does her career. The earliest painting in the show is from the 1920s, and the latest work was made in 1984, the year she died. Neel herself was a woman who refused to settle for her lot in life. She was a mother. She had 4 children, one who died. She was also ambitious at a moment when women weren't expected to be ambitious, and at a moment when women weren't really supposed to be artists. And even though she raised children and worked very hard to raise her children, she was committed to her own independence and autonomy.
The subtitle, People Come First, is actually drawn from an interview Neel gave in 1950, where she said, for her, people come first. Her devotion to pictures of people had very much to do with her enduring humanism. She was humanistic in her sensibilities and felt that her art was, to some extent, a buffer against multiple dehumanizing forces in American culture, including capitalism, and much of her work comes from that political perspective.
This is Margaret Evans' Pregnant from 1978. It's probably my favorite work in the exhibition. It's the first painting by Neel that you see as you approach the exhibition galleries. Neel painted a number of women nude while they were pregnant, and she really preferred to paint women near the ends of their pregnancies when their bodies were at their most extreme and most plastic. Neel painted Margaret Evans when she was pregnant with twins. One of the things I love about this painting is the attention that Neel paid, not just to Margaret Evans' body, but to her pregnant body, to all the ways that women's bodies are made unfamiliar by virtue of pregnancy. Her enlarged nipples, her engorged veins, her swollen belly, the mottled flesh of her legs and feet and ankles. That look on Margaret Evans' face, too, is unforgettable. She looks expectant in all kinds of ways, physically and also psychologically. Her eyes are wide. She seems slightly terrified and uncertain of what's happening to her. This is a really important painting because there were many subjects that Neel painted that she shouldn't have painted. And so in the same way that Neel did things that women weren't supposed to do or weren't expected to do, she also painted people that she wasn't supposed to or wasn't expected to, and she did so in ways that were also unusual and unconventional.
From a certain perspective, the exhibition is also about New York, or more specifically, Neel's long engagement with the city.
Neel was born outside of Philadelphia, and she came to New York for the first time with her husband, Carlos, in the late 1920s. They lived in the Bronx, they left for a few years, and then Neel came back in the early 1930s. She lived and worked in New York. She was a New Yorker, and with the exception of a few paintings she made, everything she created, everything she produced was in New York and was of New York, was about New York.
New York was certainly Neel's greatest muse and her most faithful subject. She painted its people, she painted its places, and her art was coextensive with her life and environment. So Neel captured the beauty of New York, but also the challenges of New York, and especially those effects as they're manifested on the people, the residents of New York. This is a painting dating to 1936 called, quite plainly, Nazis Murder Jews. The painting evokes a May Day parade from 1936 that Neel may or may not have attended, but she certainly knew about. The painting really highlights Neel's engagement with pressing political and historical issues of her day, and the degree to which communist organizations were really on the front end of calling attention to the discrimination and slaughter of Jews in Germany. Neel's painting suggests the immense size of this protest parade, but the painting also gives a sense of how organized and peaceful it was. People sometimes overlook the fact that she was very much engaged in life on the street and politics on the street, and this painting is a really good example of that aspect of her life and art. We're looking at a double portrait by Neel, dating from her many, many years living and working in Spanish Harlem. These two beautiful young girls, Antonia and Carmen, were neighbors of Neel's. And it just gives a great sense of Neel's connection to her sitters, regardless of their age. She treated children with the same kind of intensity and seriousness and engagement as she did her adult sitters, and I think it really comes through here. These two girls, their expressions here are so poignant and to some extent maybe inquisitive, but absolutely not sentimental. They are looking clear-eyed at you. They don't shy from us. They are sitting quite still and holding their presence and look at us as equals. They're so engaging as sitters, partly because of Neel's technique, which has, in certain passages, quite a high level of finish and detail, whereas others are left quite abstract. Neel is drawing our attention as viewers very much to their faces and to their eyes, where Neel has really attended most intensely to their likenesses, which helps to make you feel connected to them as well.
The second section of the exhibition is devoted to the subject of home. Neel never had the money to rent her own studio. She was also raising two sons on her own, and for both of those reasons, she had to paint at home in whatever room wasn't occupied by other people. So her home was always the stage, a setting for her portrait and still lives, but it also becomes very much an actor or a protagonist in these paintings. Neel also painted activities that happened inside of the home, like lovemaking, like child-rearing, like painting. One of the highlights is a series of watercolors and pastels that Neel made in the mid to late 1930s, erotic watercolors and pastels. These are some of the most radical works that she produced over the course of her career, and more than one very prominent feminist art historian, including Linda Nochlin, called Neel out for praise precisely because she appropriated the genre of erotica for women. Historically, women appear in erotic paintings as the object of an almost always male gaze. In these watercolors and pastels, though, Neel is very much the agent of desire. In Alice and Jose from 1938, we see Neel herself. This is one of her very rare self-portraits. She's lying in bed, eyes closed, with her partner, Jose, a Puerto Rican musician with whom she had her first son, Richard. And I think about all that was going on in Neel's life in 1938. She was fiercely and with great determination making a name, a career for herself. She'd recently joined the Federal Art Project. In 1935, she became a member of the Communist Party. And it was that same year that she produced her first erotic watercolor. And I think about all the revolutions that were happening in Neel's life in the mid to late 1930s. And these were revolutions of her own making. They were political revolutions and they were sexual revolutions, and they play out in these works so wonderfully. This is Hartley on the Rocking Horse from 1943. It's a portrait of Neel's second son, Hartley, who is 2 or 3. He's sitting astride a rocking horse that Neel found and repainted for her son. Hidden in the background is another one of Neel's very rare self-portraits, and you see her reflected in a mirror, painting the very picture that we see in front of us. I think it's a very deliberate nod to Las Meninas by Velázquez. Neel definitely knew her art history, and she was aware very much of the conventions of artist self-portraits. This painting exemplifies the double role that Neel's home played, but it also dramatizes conflict that Neel spoke about throughout her life, which is the conflict between motherhood and career.
A large and important subgroup of Neel's output focuses on pictures of activists, artists, civil rights leaders, feminist leaders, and other personalities to whom she was drawn. As quite a nonconformist herself, Neel was particularly drawn to unusual subjects and unusual sitters who were pushing boundaries and in some cases made people a little bit uncomfortable or were flaunting norms. And in that sense, I think Neel had great affection for them and feeling of connection to especially her sitters who were sort of operating outside of conventional society. To my mind, this is one of Neel's greatest paintings from the 1970s. Jackie Curtis, whom you see on the right with the red hair and the black stockings, was quite a character and became a kind of cult figure in the Lower East Side counterculture through the late 60s and into the 1970s, and was gender nonconforming from the very beginning of Jackie Curtis's career. But what I think is very interesting about this painting of Curtis by Neel is it really suggests Jackie Curtis's lust for the spotlight. Jackie showed up for the sitting with friend and sometimes collaborator Rita Red, whom Neel opted then also to paint. You see Jackie Curtis leaning forward and even sort of beginning to press Rita Red, unfortunately, out of the painting, despite the fact Rita Red looks like a kind of buttress who is holding Jackie Curtis up. But that, I think, was to some extent indicative of their relationship. And Neel is really alluding to that here, and specifically Curtis's almost insatiable desire for celebrity.
Counterculture is the largest section of the show, and you'll find in this section pictures of underground performers and artists, but you'll also find portraits of labor union organizers, members of the Communist Party, very prominent feminists, and these groups mixed. Neel was herself an artist and a communist. And so the section is really meant to point to and dramatize the overlap of art and politics in Neel's life, as well as in her painting. And that plays out, of course, in her choice of subject. James Farmer was a co-founder of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, which he helped establish in Chicago in 1942. It was informed by Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent protest or action. CORE played a really key role in sit-ins, boycotts, voter registration drives, the March on Washington. Farmer himself was responsible for initiating and organizing the Freedom Rides, which is probably what he's most famous for. One of the points we want to get across as much as possible in the exhibition is that the meaning of Neel's paintings reside not just in who she painted, but how she painted them. And so, to my eyes, Neel communicates not just Farmer's personality, his sense of conviction. She communicates his politics through formal and stylistic choices. Farmer, who was a large man in life and in reputation, feels compressed into the four walls of this canvas, which makes him feel bigger, actually, and more powerful because it contains his energy. The pose of the body communicates tension and energy held in reserve. This picture of Andy Warhol is important because this isn't the Andy Warhol that we know in 2021, nor do I think it's the Andy Warhol that most people would have known in 1970. Andy Warhol was known for very carefully managing his self-image, and that self-image was always based on control. It was defined by its lack of passion, was insistently kind of neutral. But here, Warhol seems to submit entirely to Neel, and he relinquishes that sense of stagecraft for which he's so famous. First and foremost, he's partially nude. And because he's nude, he's exposing to the viewer's gaze the scars from the attempt on his life from 1968. He's also exposing to view the corset that he wore around his lower abdomen for support. His eyes are closed, and that too, I think, is very significant because Andy Warhol, when he was alive, he was always the one looking. He was the one behind the camera. He was doing the shooting and the making. But here he is rendered absolutely passive and completely vulnerable. I think it's important too that in this instance, Neel chose to leave a great deal of the canvas unfinished. Neel was known, especially towards the end of her life, to leave more and more of her canvases un or underpainted. For Neel, an unfinished painting was a modern painting, to leave traces of her brushwork, of her method, of her hand. But I think in the case of this portrait of Andy Warhol, the unfinishedness also operates symbolically. It signals a being that is himself unfinished or undone, a being that's trapped in a state of arrested development, much like the painting itself. This painting, Futility of Effort, was made in 1930 and is meant to distill into a very abstract, very monochromatic painting two experiences. The first was the loss of her daughter, Cynthia, to diphtheria in 1927. And the second was the death of a child she read about in a local newspaper, a child who had died by choking on the bars of a crib while its mother was working in a room next door. Neel was so moved by these two experiences, which are the experiences of mothers, that she decided to make this painting. Neel described the Futility of Effort as one of her most revolutionary paintings, and we might think that was because it is one of her most abstract, one of her most economical paintings, but I think it's more likely that she considered it revolutionary because it gave visual expression to real female experiences, not sugar-coated or romanticized female experiences, but real, tough, concrete, hard as nails female experiences. Those were not considered proper subjects for art, whether by men or by women. And Neel, really early on, beginning in the 1930s, just threw that convention out the door.
One of the large sections in the exhibition calls out Neel's really powerful and long-standing engagement with the subject of motherhood in her art. Neel was herself a mother, and so in this regard was connected to her sitters. In a way, Neel's depictions of mothers are connected to what she called the great dichotomy in her own life, where she, of course, loved her children, but she also wanted to paint. And as a woman artist, she felt pulled in these two often diametrically opposed directions. The painting here focuses on a very renowned and recently deceased groundbreaking feminist art historian by the name of Linda Nochlin. Nochlin was part of the circles of feminists that Neel herself began to orbit in the 1970s onward. And this is just such a beautiful depiction of Linda Nochlin with her daughter Daisy. You get a sense of Linda Nochlin's great intellect, but she's also, of course, very close with her daughter, who seems to be squirming just a bit, and Linda Nochlin is working, you can see a little bit, to try to keep her daughter sitting still. One of the many, many beautiful details and elements of this picture is that both their left hands appear on the armrest. And in a way, I think they are placed there by Neel as a kind of comparison. And so you have Daisy's very youthful, small hand with Linda Nochlin's mature hand, a hand that is beginning to show some effects of age, maybe. So there's a beautiful sense of a generational relationship between them, of course, but it also evokes stages in life as represented by this mother and this child. Neel engaged with the poignant, powerful, and complicated subject and experience of motherhood, both before birth and after birth. This image, which is entitled Childbirth from 1939, in particular highlights the fact that as an artist, Neel goes places few artists, if any artists, especially women artists of her generation and of this early period of the 30s, dared to go. to portray something as sacred and culturally valued as motherhood as an excruciating, almost nightmarish experience in this instance is just something not a lot of artists, even today, would have the bravery to do. Neel was a great student of the history of art and also was very much aware of the art of her own day. So we're taking the opportunity by drawing on the great treasures of the Met's collection to establish some dialogues between Neel's art and some art of her contemporaries, but also art by older artists that she sometimes invoked.
Neel was always reluctant to admit to having been influenced by another artist. She really fiercely guarded her originality and autonomy, and I think that's in part because she was a woman who had to fight for every crumb. We know, though, that she, at the very least, admired Chaim Soutin's work, and I think this comparison between Still Life with Rayfish and Thanksgiving, one of Neel's funniest and most irreverent paintings, is very instructive. Both works are slightly hallucinogenic, thanks to that tilted, vertiginous point of view, the loose brushwork, the kind of liberties that both artists take with realism, with representation, the way those recognizable subjects, the food, the fish, the fowl, the way they dissolve into abstraction by virtue of that loose brushwork. Neel was an artist who, for all her irreverence and radicalism, really operated within art history's dominant genres, the portrait, the still life, the landscape. But she overturned and adapted and subverted those genres at the same time. So she kind of operated inside and outside those art historical traditions simultaneously.
As an artist who was very much engaged in the history of art, it was almost inevitable that Neel would engage with the nude. But she does so, like always, in a way that is unflinching, as a counter to the historical and typical depictions of bodies as beautiful, as perfect. Neel's bodies are, by contrast, distinctly imperfect, as she thought humanity itself was beautifully imperfect.
The only self-portrait Neel painted in which she is the principal figure didn't occur until 1980. Neel was by this point 80 years old, and I think it's incredible. She waited to make her first true self-portrait until she was an older woman nearing the end of her life, and she decided to depict herself nude. The body that you see in this painting, this nude, elderly female body, is simply one that, like the pregnant nude, is one that really never had a place in art history. And its absence is something that Neel wants very much to correct. It's meant to be provocative. It's meant to be subversive. It's meant to draw attention to long-held stereotypes. It was her own personal response to a trope within the feminist art movement.
Her nude portrait of the art critic John Perrault is perhaps one of the, if not the most memorable male nude Neel painted. This is this wonderfully disarming, casual depiction of Perrault in all of his gangly, hairy glory in a pose which is very much like a classic odalisque out of art history, a fact that would not have been lost on Neel. And in a way, she's painting Perrault in this manner as a kind of tongue-in-cheek foil to this history of the odalisque, except her odalisque is distinctly male. Calling attention to Neel's great skill as a painter and as a colorist, what's wonderful here with regard to palette is the warmth of his tanned body offset by the cool blue rendering of the sheet that he's on, which enhances the immediacy and the warmth of his body. While Neel is remembered primarily as a figurative painter, she was, over the course of her career, engaged very much with issues around abstraction. So we have a section of the exhibition that really focuses specifically on Neel's relationship with abstraction over a range of subjects, including still life. Neel isn't thought of as a still life painter, but she painted still life throughout her career, and she was actually very proud of her abilities in this genre. Images like this still life with fruit from 1940 give a little window on her life at home. In this context, though, we want to call attention to the degrees to which and the ways in which Neel's work is also operating abstractly. And it's so clear and beautiful here in her simplified depiction of these fruits in a bowl, which she has rendered in these luscious, bright, direct passages of impasto paint. She often is experimenting with the relationship between a two-dimensional plane and a three-dimensional space. So there's almost always this tension in Neel's work that you see from very early, really through the very end.
Black draftee James Hunter was completed in 1965. It depicts a man named James Hunter that Neel met on the streets of New York. Neel invited him to her apartment for a sitting. They had at least one or two sittings. It's not clear from the painting. She got at least as far as outlining the figure in her beautiful line, filling in most of the head and neck and one of the hands. But the rest of the figure remains incomplete. And the story goes that Hunter was never able to return for his second or third or fourth sitting because he was called away to the Vietnam War. Thus the painting's title, Black Draftee. Now, even though Neel wasn't able to complete the painting, she decided that it was finished. So here, the unfinished nature of the painting tells an almost heartbreaking story about the vulnerability, the ephemerality of human life, but also the life of this particular Black man, subject to the whims of the US government and sent to die for a country that probably wouldn't have mourned his life. Neel was a survivor. She made paintings and pictures about surviving, about what it meant for her as a woman and a mother and an artist to survive. But she also produced a large number of works about other people's, other New Yorkers' struggle to survive. She lived her life as a political creature, and she painted as a political creature. And her politics are expressed in her paintings, not just through who she chose to depict, whether famous or unknown, but through the way she chose to paint them.
In the wake of renewed and powerful and persuasive calls for social justice, Neel's legacy seems ever more germane to our moment, and that is one of her great and enduring attributes.